When Dr. Lucas Mercer, a grieving anthropologist desperate for redemption, set off into the mist-shrouded highlands of Papua New Guinea, he thought he was there to observe an ancient tribe's fading traditions. But what he uncovered was not anthropology, it was prophecy. The final page of his journal, stained and torn, ends mid-sentence. One word is circled in blood-red ink: exchange. What did he see? Who, or what, did he leave behind? And what would you sacrifice to make it out alive? Dr. Lucas Mercer had spent his life decoding the rituals of cultures most people only read about in textbooks, but when his name hit the news last month, it wasn't for another award-winning paper. It was because he'd been missing for 3 weeks in the remote highlands of Papua New Guinea. A search team funded by his university found nothing except a water-damaged notebook lying in the brush near a crumbled clearing, pages stuck together with what some swore was blood. Its entries didn't make sense, written in alternating tones of scientific observation and frenzied paranoia, as if the writer had been drifting between genius and madness. But one thing stood out: a passage referencing a tribe that officially didn't exist. The Kyala were considered myth even among locals, ghost people of the mountains who supposedly vanished generations ago. Yet Lucas claimed to have met them, lived among them, even participated in their most sacred rites. At first, no one believed it. Then came the photo. One blurred, overexposed Polaroid had been tucked into the journal. Lucas standing beside 2 dark-skinned men in elaborate bone jewelry, their eyes white with ceremonial ash, a third figure looming behind him, face obscured, holding a knife carved from what looked like human femur. In academic circles, it sent shockwaves. To his former students, Lucas had always been a controversial figure, a man willing to go where others wouldn't, both physically and ethically. He was brilliant, charismatic, but broken. After losing his wife in a tragic accident and resigning amid accusations of manipulating indigenous rituals for sensational documentaries, Lucas disappeared from the academic world. But his last recorded grant request, filed quietly months earlier, revealed he was seeking out uncontacted tribes in the Sepik River basin. Many believed it was a desperate last act to reclaim his legacy. What no one expected was for him to succeed. According to the journal, he made contact after following a carved totem trail, one not listed on any map. He described the first night vividly: the haunting call of a bamboo flute, the glow of fires from within hollowed-out trees, and the overwhelming feeling that he was being watched. "They were waiting for me," he wrote, "as if they knew I was coming before I even boarded the plane." He spoke of voices in a language no linguist had catalogued, and rituals that aligned perfectly with the lunar eclipse cycle, a detail eerily precise. But most unsettling was his repeated use of one phrase in all caps: "I am not an observer." It was unlike him. Colleagues who reviewed the journal said Lucas had always kept emotional distance from his subjects, priding himself on objectivity. Yet here, he sounded unhinged, as though the line between anthropologist and initiate had blurred. Toward the end of the first section, one paragraph stood out: "They call it the blood moon ritual. It happens only when the sky turns copper. There is no translation for the word sacrifice, only exchange. Tonight, they say, is the beginning. And I am expected to stay." That single sentence, "I am expected to stay," became the tagline for the viral podcast episode that reignited public interest. What did he mean by that? Stay as a guest? Stay as a scholar? Or stay as something else entirely? The journal stops there for several pages. Then, in shaky handwriting, one final line emerges before the ink runs off the page: "Not everyone here wants me to leave." Lucas Mercer wasn't always the man desperate enough to follow phantom stories into unmapped jungles. Once, he stood at the pinnacle of academic anthropology, handsome, articulate, and lauded for his work decoding the myth cycles of forgotten civilizations. His lectures at the university would overflow with students eager to hear his first-hand tales from the Amazon, the Sahel, and the Tibetan plateau. But behind his confidence lived a deeper hunger, a gnawing need not just to document the rituals of others but to believe in something sacred himself. That need only intensified after the accident. 2 years before his disappearance, Lucas lost his wife, Hannah, in a freak car crash while he was away filming a documentary in the Andes. She had left him a voicemail before it happened, a message he never received until after her death. It was tender, even forgiving. She was tired of being second to his career, but she wanted to find their way back to each other. The realization gutted him. Her voice played in his head for months, and though he returned to the university and tried to resume teaching, something had shifted. He became erratic, moody, fixated on a new kind of project, one his colleagues and sponsors found troubling. Lucas stopped writing papers, stopped publishing, and instead spoke of discovering what anthropology lost when it stopped believing. He claimed ancient cultures held truths not meant for textbooks, but for transformation. The final break came when he returned from a trip to the Philippines with footage showing a funeral rite that many believed he had staged. The university called it unethical, exploitative. Lucas was forced to resign. Most assumed he would fade into academic obscurity or re-emerge on late-night talk shows, defending himself to dwindling audiences. Instead, he vanished entirely, retreating to a cabin in the Oregon mountains. There, surrounded by books, maps, and old tribal recordings, he built a wall-sized collage of mythic symbols, linguistic patterns, and hand-drawn maps, many based on whispered accounts from indigenous guides and unverified explorer journals. That's where the Kayala first appeared, briefly mentioned in a footnote from a 1923 missionary's diary, who claimed to have seen ash-covered children and a man with eyes rolled white as snow before abandoning his journey upriver. Lucas became obsessed. He traced patterns of solar eclipses and lunar calendars, triangulated villages that had gone silent, and pieced together a path deep into the Sepik River jungle. He believed the Kayala were not just a tribe lost to time, but the key to a much older story. In one late-night recording found on his laptop, he spoke directly into the camera, his voice uneven. "We talk about human sacrifice like it's a relic of savagery, but what if it wasn't about violence? What if it was about balance? What if someone has to give for the rest to keep going? We think we've evolved past it, but maybe we've just forgotten the cost." That idea haunted him. The concept of exchange, not as punishment, but as a sacred necessity, became central to his research. He wasn't merely looking for lost rituals, he was looking for redemption. To Lucas, this wasn't just an expedition, it was a pilgrimage. Hannah's voice echoed in his dreams, sometimes whispering his name in the middle of the jungle, sometimes asking, "Will you finally stay still?" He believed that if he could understand why ancient peoples made the choices they did, why they gave their most precious offerings to unseen forces, he might also understand how to give something back himself. That yearning made him reckless, and it made him blind. When he finally set out, traveling through Port Moresby and then taking a rusted cargo boat upriver into the dense green sprawl of Papua New Guinea's heart, he didn't even tell his family. He left only one message with a colleague: "If I don't come back, let them know I went willing. For once, I'm not running away, I'm walking in." At first, the trip seemed like any other. Lucas had spent years braving difficult terrain and unpredictable cultures. But something felt different this time. He stopped writing in his usual academic tone and began describing the jungle in poetic fragments. "The air buzzes with hunger, every leaf feels like an eye, the path does not curve, it chooses." And then, the first real sign, a trail of carved wooden figures, depicting men with open mouths and animals with human eyes. He followed it, day after day, even as guides turned back one by one, spooked by tales of the Kayala's cursed valley. Lucas pressed forward alone, driven not by madness, but by the aching belief that there was still one story left in the world untouched by tourism, untouched by science, untouched by guilt. When he first saw the smoke curling from the trees and heard the rhythmic clack of bamboo against rock, he wrote only one line in his journal: "I have found them. They were waiting." The jungle gave way like a wound splitting open. After days of silence and spectral movement between the trees, Lucas stumbled into a clearing where sound itself seemed to kneel. A ring of ancient banyan trees encircled a village of stilted huts, their roofs stitched from palm leaves and blackened with soot. Smoke drifted upward in lazy spirals from smoldering pits, and faces emerged from the shadows. Brown-skinned, ash-painted, their eyes wide with a mixture of suspicion and something Lucas couldn't name. Not fear. Not hostility. It was expectation. A line of children stood perfectly still, bones tied into their hair, each holding a woven pouch. The oldest stepped forward and extended the bag toward Lucas. Inside, He found a piece of obsidian carved into the shape of an open mouth. "To see," the child said in clear, practiced English, "you must give something first." Before Lucas could respond, a woman approached, tall, cloaked in feathers and beads, her face veiled behind a net of tiny bones. She gestured toward one of the huts and spoke in their native tongue. An elder beside her translated, "You rest. Then you meet Shua." That night, as firelight flickered against the walls of his assigned hut, Lucas wrote furiously in his journal. He noted the communal structure of the tribe, the lack of visible weaponry, and the strange absence of fear in their interactions with him. But what unsettled him was the drumbeat, a low, unending rhythm that seemed to pulse from the ground itself, vibrating up through the soles of his feet. No one played it. It was just there. Constant. Unrelenting. At midnight, he was summoned. Led by torchlight to a circular platform raised by bone-white stilts, he encountered the figure they called Shua. The shaman wore a headdress of dried leaves, and his skin was covered in dark, deliberate scars that formed symbols Lucas couldn't translate. His eyes were milky grey, blind or painted, Lucas couldn't tell. But the man saw him all the same. "You came because you are empty," Shua said in perfect English, his voice dry as bark. "You want to fill your soul with something old. Something holy." Lucas nodded, barely breathing. The shaman placed a hand on his chest and said, "Then you must witness. But remember, witnessing is not the same as watching. If you look too long, the forest will look back." It sounded like metaphor. Lucas, ever the scholar, wrote it down as such. But when the next day brought a procession of villagers carrying animal skulls, masks of bark, and bundles of dried herbs, he realized this was no performance. They were preparing something sacred, something secret. He was permitted to follow them, always at a distance, until they reached a stone altar half buried in moss at the edge of a cliff. There, they chanted in low, resonant tones, each syllable grinding like rock on rock. One woman stood in the center, arms raised, eyes closed. The others formed a circle, and the drumming, though still sourceless, grew louder. Lucas stepped closer, and a young man blocked his path with an outstretched hand. "You must wait," he said simply. "It is not your turn." That night, Lucas couldn't sleep. He had seen the expressions on their faces, not terror, but something even more haunting, solemn joy. These were not people participating in fearful superstition. They believed in this rite with all their being. It gave them order, purpose, identity. And yet, he couldn't ignore the phrase Shua had spoken. Witnessing is not the same as watching. What was he witnessing? And how much of it was meant for him? On the third day, Shua returned with a group of elders. They presented Lucas with a garment, woven from dried reeds and painted with red clay. "You will sit with us at the next ceremony," the shaman said. "You have been chosen to see." The phrase triggered something in Lucas. Chosen. Not permitted. Chosen. He pressed for answers, trying to keep his voice level, his tone respectful. "What will I see?" he asked. Shua smiled without warmth. "The truth of balance. The way the world does not fall apart." Lucas wrote later that night, "I think they intend to show me their version of sacrifice. I must stay objective. This is their belief, their world." But even as he wrote those words, his handwriting shook. Something about the people had begun to change. They watched him more closely. The children stopped laughing around him. His meals arrived colder. He felt less like a guest and more like an offering being seasoned. On the fifth night, a thunderstorm cracked open the sky, and for a moment, the drumbeat stopped. In that brief silence, Lucas heard something that chilled him, a voice, not human, whispering from the trees. Not language. Not words. Just breath, heavy and deliberate, circling his hut. When the drums resumed, the voice disappeared. The next morning, he found a trail of red handprints leading from the edge of his hut to the altar cliff. He followed them. At the end of the trail, embedded in the ground, was a freshly carved totem, this one with his own face etched into the wood. Beneath it, the word Ishalu had been painted in blood-red pigment. Lucas asked one of the elders what it meant. The man bowed his head. "It means who trades." He tried to dismiss it as metaphor, myth, symbol. But deep down, Lucas felt it. He wasn't there to study a culture. He had stepped into something living, something ancient, and it had already wrapped its fingers around him. By the 7th day, the drums were no longer background noise. They were the rhythm of Lucas's waking life, pulsing in his skull even when silence fell. He had begun to dream in chants, waking with fragments of their language etched into his mind like ancestral echoes. The villagers no longer treated him with curiosity but with solemn reverence, as though he had crossed an invisible threshold. Meals were delivered by silent children who would not meet his eyes, and a group of masked women swept the ground around his hut each dawn, whispering prayers into the dust. Lucas tried to maintain his notes, his scientific detachment, but his handwriting had grown jagged, unstable. "They say I must witness the Ashalu in full," he scribbled. "They do not call it sacrifice, they call it a balance. A debt paid. But someone always gives." That morning, Shua summoned him again. This time, the shaman wore a crown of teeth, and his staff was decorated with small bones carved with symbols. The hut smelled of ash and something metallic. Lucas was offered a bowl of thick, warm liquid, blood mixed with crushed bark, he assumed, before being told to sit. "You must know," Shua said calmly, "why this is done. The forest feeds us. It gives birth, but it also takes. When the balance is broken, it hungers. A life must answer for a life." Lucas asked, "What life was taken?" The shaman turned his grey eyes toward him. "The child is sick. Not by poison, not by man. By the taking of balance. Someone from outside brought weight without gift. The child's soul is fading. You are here. So the choice must come." Lucas sat frozen, stomach tightening. "Choice?" he whispered. "There is always choice," Shua replied. "But there must be an exchange." Lucas struggled to keep his breath steady. They were speaking in metaphors, he told himself. Symbolic language. But a cold clarity had begun to seep into him. This ritual, this Ashalu, was not symbolic. It was literal. A child was dying, and the tribe believed balance could only be restored through an offering. Not a ceremony. Not a prayer. A life. He asked what the options were, heart-pounding. Shua's answer chilled him. Either the tribe loses its child, or you become part of the Kyala. Lucas knew what that meant. He remembered the phrase carved beneath the totem that bore his face, "Ishalu, who trades." It was a sentence masked in hospitality but soaked in finality. To become part of the Kyala didn't mean staying and learning. It meant giving himself, body, spirit, presence, to them. Forever. That evening, Lucas was invited to a preparation feast. The child was there, frail and curled in a woven sling held by her mother. The villagers danced in a wide ring around a fire, singing in a minor key that made the air feel tight. The mother placed a hand on Lucas's arm. Her eyes were rimmed with tears, not of sadness but hope. "You came," she said, "because the forest called you. We believe you were sent. A gift for a gift." Lucas stared into the fire and felt his world tilt. He wasn't supposed to be part of this. He was the observer, the anthropologist, the outsider. And yet, something about the woman's voice, soft, grateful, ancient, made that line blur. The next day, the village gathered. The altar had been decorated with braided vines and dried flowers. The sick child lay atop a wooden cradle carved into the form of a bird, her eyes shut, skin pale. Shua gestured for Lucas to approach. The tribe began to chant, and in that sound, Lucas felt the weight of every civilization he had studied, every myth he had thought metaphor, every rite he had dismissed as relic. This was not performance. This was not madness. It was belief in its purest, rawest form. He stood at the edge of the altar, knees weak. "You do not have to die," Shua said behind him. "You only have to give." Lucas turned. "Give what?" Shua touched his forehead. "Your place. Your future. Stay. Become. Take the child's sickness. Be the balance." Lucas staggered back. Was this what they meant? Some kind of spiritual substitution. A ritualistic transference. But no matter how he tried to explain it logically, the outcome was clear. If he stayed, the child would live. If he walked away, She would die. He wrote that night, "I have spent my life translating rituals, decoding belief systems from a safe distance. Now I am the subject of one. I am no longer the narrator. I am the story." For hours, he wrestled with the choice. He thought of Hannah. He thought of his career, of the students who once idolized him. But mostly, he thought of the child, whose breath rattled softly like wind through dry leaves, whose mother had already begun to hum her a lullaby of gratitude. At dawn, a white cloth was laid beside the altar. The sun rose, and with it, the drumming stopped. All eyes turned to him. The cloth remained untouched. The sun bled red across the tree line as Lucas walked alone toward the edge of the village, clutching his journal like a lifeline. The white cloth still lay beside the altar, untouched and fluttering faintly in the wind like a question left unanswered. That morning, he had been given until sundown. Not told directly, not threatened, but the message was as clear as bone against bark. The choice had not been revoked, but time was a closing mouth. Shua had come to him once more, silent this time, placing a small carved figure into his palm, a faceless human form, half-painted black. A symbol of incompletion. Lucas held it for hours, his thumb brushing against its splintered edges until it bled. He had hoped for clarity, for some sacred revelation or academic detachment to rescue him from the trap of his own morality. But all he had was that gnawing certainty. Someone would have to give. In the fevered quiet of his hut, Lucas opened the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards, a space he'd noticed days earlier but dared not explore until desperation overruled fear. He pried the slats open with the obsidian shard the child had once gifted him and found a narrow crawlspace filled with stale air and damp earth. At first, he saw only darkness. But then came the glint of bone. Small, white, cleaned by time and perhaps ritual, laid in deliberate geometric formations. Skulls, ribs, femurs, all stacked in symbolic patterns, each bundle bound by faded strips of foreign fabric. These weren't tribal remains. These were the dead left behind by others. Outsiders. Visitors. Anthropologists. Traders. Explorers. Lucas recognized the corner of a weather-worn leather notebook among the relics and pulled it free, only to find the name G. Howlett scrawled inside, a name from a missionary diary he'd once dismissed as myth. Inside were 2 pages of notes, frantic and incomplete. The last entry read, "The ritual does not end when you agree. It begins. You do not give yourself. They take the part of you that will not leave." Lucas stumbled back, bile rising in his throat. This wasn't a cultural offering. This was a system of containment, a sacrifice not to gods but to something older and more insatiable. These remains were not honored, they were silenced. The Kyala were not preserving a sacred balance. They were enforcing one. The tribe had made an ancient pact, perhaps long before the outside world encroached. To keep their children alive, their lands fertile, and their spirits appeased, they had to give, always give. And the forest, or whatever force pulsed behind its endless eyes, accepted only what had once been full of purpose. Outsiders brought weight with them, guilt, grief, ego. That was what fed the ritual. Not just blood, but meaning. Lucas dropped the figurine and fled the crawlspace, his breath ragged and his thoughts unraveling. He tried to convince himself that he had misread it, that maybe these were criminals, long-forgotten transgressors. But the journal he now held, like his own, spoke of invitation, of hospitality, of choice. And yet, none had left. Back in his hut, he opened his notebook and began to write, not academically, not analytically, but as a man documenting his final thoughts. The ritual is not about death. It is about making you choose what part of yourself dies, he wrote. They don't need my body. They need my surrender. They need me to accept that I cannot go back. Then came the sound, a soft rustle outside. When he opened the door, the entire tribe stood facing him, silently, holding torches. The child was cradled in her mother's arms, her color improved, her chest rising more evenly. Shua stood at the front and said only one word, "Now." Lucas stepped forward, his mind a blur of fear and fascination. He remembered the myths, the ones he used to mock, of men who ventured too far into the hearts of old gods and never returned whole. Perhaps the Kyala were not liars. Perhaps they were the keepers of a truth too immense for the modern world to stomach. That the universe did not move on reason, but on trade. Not sacrifice. Exchange. The altar loomed ahead, but Lucas turned toward the jungle, journal clutched to his chest, legs moving on instinct. Shouts rose behind him, not angry, but pleading. He ran until his lungs tore against his ribs and the forest swallowed the torches behind him. He didn't stop until he collapsed near the riverbed where he'd first arrived. There, he shoved his journal under a gnarled root, covered it with leaves, and whispered, "Let someone know." Then he faded into unconsciousness. Weeks later, a rescue team found him wandering near the base of a cliff, skeletal, barefoot, and barely coherent. He spoke only in the Kayala tongue, eyes empty, words clipped. When he saw his journal again, cleaned and preserved by the university, he wept quietly and said nothing. The last page bore a single line, circled again and again, "I left something behind." No one knew what he meant. But beneath his fingernails, they found traces of red clay. And in the folds of his jacket was the faceless figurine, now fully painted black. Lucas Mercer returned to the world not with a roar of revelation, but with the quiet stillness of a man who had walked through something sacred, or cursed, and come out hollowed. When the rescue team lifted him into the helicopter, he didn't fight or flinch. He blinked slowly at the whirring blades above him, then closed his eyes like a man being lowered into a grave. No bruises. No visible injuries. Yet something was missing from his gaze, like a light permanently dimmed. The medical staff at the hospital in Port Moresby described his demeanor as calm but unreachable. He spoke fluently, answered basic questions, and even thanked his rescuers. But anything regarding his time in the jungle prompted a vacant stare. The doctors ruled out trauma-induced amnesia. He remembered who he was, recited historical dates with perfect clarity, and even completed advanced linguistic puzzles they tested him with. But when asked about the Kayala, he simply replied, "They are not mine to speak of." No elaboration. No emotion. His family was flown in, and though his sister cried at his bedside, Lucas only touched her hand briefly and said, "It's good to be here," as if reading the line from someone else's story. The journal, recovered by the team and handed over to the university, became a source of instant obsession in academic circles. Experts in anthropology, linguistics, and theology debated its authenticity for weeks. Many argued the final entries, those after his supposed discovery of the bone chamber, read more like confessionals than field notes. Some scholars claimed it was a masterful piece of psychological fiction, an elaborate hoax orchestrated by a desperate man looking to reclaim his legacy. But others, particularly those who had studied indigenous myth cycles, noticed unsettling consistencies. The ritual Lucas described aligned too closely with legends found not just in Papua New Guinea, but in disparate cultures across the globe, stories of the substitute soul, a belief that life must be restored not through the death of a body, but through the surrender of purpose. One tribal historian pointed out that in several regions, figures like the Kayala existed in whispered warnings, keepers of a covenant too ancient to question. Meanwhile, Lucas declined every interview request. He refused to write a book. He stopped returning emails and slowly severed ties with all former colleagues. Eventually, he disappeared from the public eye entirely, retreating to a remote cabin deep in Oregon's Cascade Mountains, not far from where he had first gone to mourn Hannah. Neighbors described him as quiet, kind, and reserved. He kept to himself but was never unfriendly. He grew herbs, carved wooden figures, and often left bundles of offerings at the edge of the forest. Small totems made of twine and ash, shaped like birds or faceless people. One local boy who wandered too close to the cabin claimed he saw Lucas speaking to a tree, his forehead pressed against its bark, whispering, "Not yet. I'm still here." A search of Lucas's home years later, after a wildfire forced evacuations, revealed shelves of handwritten journals, all blank except for one page in each, repeating the same line, "I left something behind." The original Kayala journal was eventually archived at the university's restricted collection, only viewable under supervision. But rumors persisted. That when the lights flickered in the viewing room, a faint sound echoed in the floorboards, like drums. That those who read too far into the journal had strange dreams afterward, of faceless people standing at their bedside, offering them a choice they didn't understand. Back in Papua New Guinea, the region Lucas described remained officially uninhabited. Satellite scans showed nothing but dense jungle and crumbling stone. Still, every few months, a new explorer tried to find the Kyala. None ever did. But in one case, a man returned after 4 days, trembling and unable to speak, clutching a small carved figure, a bird with human eyes. He died 2 months later in his sleep, heart stopped, eyes wide open. And Lucas? He was last seen walking the forest path behind his cabin at dusk, the sky pulsing with the same blood-orange hue he once described in his journal. When a neighbor called his name, he didn't turn. He stepped into the trees without hesitation. And though search parties combed the region, they found no footprints, no broken branches, only a white cloth folded neatly atop a moss-covered stump, and beside it, a single line carved into the bark, "Exchange complete."